Ayo, none of them have any foreign names. The same way no Arab there in Int'l, my son is not an African. Okay? I carry joy. By the time I discovered that it was a meaningless name given to me, it was too late to change on my document. So, I carry it as a marker of what was done to me, as a reminder. I tell people that by the time I was 10 years old, I was so damaged. I'm still trying to recover. Okay? Even now, by reflex, many of us have not seen indigenous names or songs or theme songs. The only thing they are singing is either Arabic or Christian songs. And that, if you know the significance of the loss, you will be crying every day. And for the conference we are having, we need to rediscover the Codex, the rituals, all those things. I mean, look at just last week we had the graduation ceremony. Right? And you want all kinds of ritual gowns and garments, costumes. If people were doing that and going to the grove, you will say they are being possessed by demons. What was happening on that field, on the stadium, is not possession. Huh? But that's how it is. That's who we have become. So this conference is very special. And I want to thank our colleagues, our mother, our Royal Majesty, a former member of the British House of Commons. She has not said that what kind of who is this boy? What does he think he is? Inviting me to Lokoja. And she accepted. She came from the UK yesterday. So thank you so much. And my sisters, you are the most welcome group. You are welcome group. Okay? When I read the kinds of things my colleagues write, my own very good friend, we lived together many years. We wrote that one book called Globalisation because he didn't understand. He couldn't understand. You live in the Caribbean and you live with real people and you understand what we have lost. You will understand the trauma. And that is very significant. I thank you all for coming. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, thank you so much.
All right, this is a round of applause. Very unconventional. Thank you very much, Prof. It's a round of applause for the Vice-Chancellor.
Thank you. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor today. Deputy Vice Administration, Registrar, Boxer, University Librarian, the Director of FUL International Center of Excellence in Environmental Humanities, the Director Academic of Africana and Indigenous Religions, representative of Panastra, our esteemed keynote speakers, Professor Paul Ugon of the University of Waterloo, Canada, and Professor Muyo Okediji of the University of Texas at Austin, USA. Distinguished scholars and researchers from within and outside Nigeria, provosts, deans, directors, and head of departments, members of staff of the university, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with profound joy that I welcome you all to the 3rd International Academic Conference, jointly organized by the Federal University Lokoja International Center of Excellence in Environmental Humanities and the Academy of Africana Indigenous Religions, Theology, Arts, in collaboration with Panastra Akudi Elisha. This gathering is not just another academic event, it is an intellectual and cultural pilgrimage that seeks to rediscover, document, and elevate the wisdom, spirituality, and creativity embedded in Africana Indigenous Religions, Theology and Arts. The theme of this year's conference, Codex, Liturgy, Rituals, Earth, Arts, Medicine and Wellness, Spirituality, Holy Sites, Saints, Ancestors, Theology, Arts, and Symbols in Indigenous Africana Religions, Theology and Arts is both rich and timely. It speaks to the interconnectedness of body, spirit, and environment, and challenges us to explore the holistic epistemologies of African peoples that have sustained communities for centuries. This conference is a clarion call to scholars and practitioners to re-engage our ancestral wisdom traditions, not as relics of the past, but as living, dynamic sources of healing, creativity, and spiritual renewal. It's a call to bridge the gap between spirituality and science, faith and medicine, ritual and reason. I'm particularly delighted that this academic engagement has attracted world-renowned scholars such as Professor Paul Ugo and Professor Muro Okeneji, whose intellectual contributions continue to shape contemporary discourse in cultural studies, theology, and the arts. Your presence here affirms that the study of African religions and culture has assumed global significance. Permit me to commend the leadership of FUL-ICEEH and AAIRTA, as well as our partners from Panastrals to Kakodorusha, for their commitment to advancing interdisciplinary and intercultural research. Through conferences like this, Federal University Lokoja continues to position itself as a center of intellectual excellence and cultural rejuvenation, a place where indigenous knowledge meets global scholarship. As a university, we are proud to host this important dialogue, which reaffirms our collective conviction that Africa's future is firmly rooted in the wisdom of its past. I therefore encourage all participants to see this conference not merely as a forum for paper presentations, but as a platform for meaningful engagement, exchange of ideas, and knowledge transformation. Let this gathering strengthen academic networks, spark innovative collaborations, and inspire new ways of thinking about theology, medicine, environment, and the arts through the African lens. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, as we commence this week-long academic and cultural exploration, I urge every one of you to participate actively, share generously, and learn purposefully. Let us ensure that by the close of this conference, each participant leaves with fresh insights, actionable ideas, and renewed commitment to promoting and preserving Africana intellectual heritage in their various spheres of influence. On this note, it is my singular honor and privilege to formally declare the 3rd International Academic Conference open. I wish you all fruitful deliberation and a memorable stay in Lokoja, the confluent city of Nigeria. Okay, just been asked that I have to unveil this book. This is Issues in Africa Indigenous Religions, edited by and Bewaji John Ayotunde Isola. So I think it should possibly to remove the job and thank you. About the book, issues in African indigenous religions. The Academy of African Indigenous Religions, Theology and Arts is the first of its type in global Africa. It was founded to ensure that critical knowledge and ideas about African indigenous religions is produced and disseminated. Over the last 2 years, the Academy has held annual conferences and seminars which have received global acclamation. One of the most important elements of the academic's vision and mission is the documentation and dissemination of knowledge and ideas about its core mandate. Issues in African indigenous religion is the first in what is conceived as a series of 12 quality publications emanating from the Academy. This volume brings to our readership community 18 peer-reviewed selected essays by scholars from diverse intellectual backgrounds. In the words of the Vice-Chancellor of Federal University Lokoja, one word suffices to describe the content of this book: groundbreaking. It is groundbreaking in the excellence of the scholarship brought together in one volume. It is groundbreaking in the depth of research that graced the chapter in the volume, and it is remarkably groundbreaking in how it commemorates excellence in attention to detail in quality, in ensuring quality. I commend this volume, Issues in African Indigenous Knowledge. Thank you. Yes. Yes, he said I should declare it unveiled, and it is hereby unveiled. Thank you. Please, you can just step forward and have copies so that we can take some photographs together. We can take some photographs together. Okay. Sorry. A copy is 5,000 naira. Please, a round of applause. The deans and directors will join me also to take a copy. Please write their names down so that
Let me go. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, with your kind permission, I'd like to make an attempt to introduce these distinguished personalities. I just hope that I'll be able to do that this morning. And first on my list is Her Royal Majesty, Ayotunde. Is actually the direct biological descendant of Alaafin Songo of Oyo. Can you put your hands together for an amazing woman? Is a stateswoman of England, a representative of 401 Orisa of Ilefe. Thank you, Ma, for coming to be a part of this occasion. We celebrate you greatly. And I have Miss Antoinette Cooper. Thank you for coming all the way to be a part of this meeting. And I have Dr. Wiseman Kun Kinsu. Thank you for coming and being a part of this program. Professor Osage Nika, thank you so very much for coming. Professor Sandra Buntun, thank you so very much for coming. Professor Davis Kahina, thank you so very much for coming. And of course our own Professor Paul Ugo is a family member. Thank you very much. I hope the news makes sense to you. This morning it's my pleasure to invite to make a quick presentation just before we take the citation of our keynote speaker. It will be Her Royal Highness to worship. You say something to your people and then we will take the keynote address. Another round of applause. I'm sure you know where she is coming from. Celebrate greatness. That's right.
Àṣẹ òrìṣà lẹ́nu mi o. Àṣẹ òrìṣà. Àṣẹ òrìṣà lẹ́nu mi o. Àṣẹ òrìṣà. Èyí mo wí. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the little opening is to announce a devolved down authority of my ancestors known as Orisha. Any Orisha, which simply means he or she is specially created and given an assignment. So it's a cherished privilege to stand on the previous protocol, to use this water to invite my ancestors to join me as they normally will do when I'm on a special royal assignment. Do I have your permission to proceed? Do I have your permission to proceed? Thank you. May I have a sister? It's not painful. Especially Lokoja. This is an Orisha, this water, would you believe? This water is Orisha, specially created with an assignment. And that assignment is to enable life. And so I invite my ancestors to bring life to this conference. This is Orisha. And this water refreshes when things are dead. And wherever there is a need for refreshment, may that take place. And finally, this water, known as Orisha, is responsible for progress. Henceforth, may progress continue to be the case within this university, its environs, the lecturers, the students, the well-wishers worldwide. Ashe. thank you for the permission. I bring you good tidings from His Imperial Majesty, Olayemi Akinwumi, Ayotunde, Olayemi Akinwumi, Emeritus, Ojaja II of Ife. He who is the 401 of our ancestors who have given me this permission to be here. Please, may I invite the organizers of today to come forward. I don't belong. It's a more cherished privilege to be here for us to thank this university for the development here, for opening another opportunity to educate on what matters. I want to also thank you for creating jobs. And I've just looked around the number of jobs you have created. And without jobs, poverty shall continue. Thank you very much for contributing to the end of poverty. Poverty of the brain and poverty of materials. And I'm going to end just with a little. Where are those who organize this? If you can sing the song, join me, and then I will also join the rest, wishing you a successful week. So please come forward. A wonderful historic moment for us to reconnect with who we are meant to be. And Lokoja has got historic relevance of that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please put your hands together for I have two songs, one in my dialect, one in English language. Edumare fún wa lọ́lúwọ̀mọ́, Edumare fún wa lọ́lúwọ̀mọ́, Olúwọ̀mọ́ máa ń dá wa lọ́rùn. Edumare fún wa lọ́lúwọ̀mọ́, Edumare fún yàrá, Edumare fún wa lọ́lúwọ̀mọ́, Olúwọ̀mọ́ máa ń dá wa lọ́rùn. Edumare fún wa lọ́lúwọ̀mọ́. What is the meaning of Oru? A special, extraordinary child. Are these three not? Just one minute. On the count of three. For they are jolly good fellows. For they are jolly good fellows. For they are jolly good fellows.
Let us put our hand one more together to Olayemi to sign. Come on. On this note, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I wish to invite our keynote speaker, Professor Paul Ugo, to stand as I introduce you to the audience. Paul, please stand up. Professor Paul Ugo holds the Bachelor of Arts degree in Theatre Arts, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Master of Arts degree in Theatre and Film Studies, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. Doctor of Philosophy, English and Film Studies, University of Alberta, Canada. Specializes in African and post-colonial world literature. He is a fellow Newton International Academy, United Kingdom, fellow Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Canada.
He's taught as assistant professor and professor at the Center for West African Studies, University of Birmingham, United Kingdom. He is a professor in the Department of English and Literature, University of Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. He is widely published. His area of interest are modern African literature, film, Nollywood cinema, African youth cultures, and Black popular cultures. He has over 400 Google Scholar citations. He is a global scholar. I have been inviting for a student address. Professor, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Let me just begin with the ordinary people on the floor before I talk about the most important people. The former DBC, when I met you 2 years ago, I had no idea that you do Oriki songs. So I feel highly flattered by that well-researched and generous introduction. Mr. Vice-Chancellor Sir, Registrar, the librarian, deans, and other directors that are present here today. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to do the keynote at this conference. For me, this is, I've done several of these lectures all over the world in different universities in the global north and here, but this one is particularly heartwarming for me because, it's okay, I can hold it. It's particularly heartwarming for me. Piero, could you help me take this laptop? Yeah. This one is particularly heartwarming for me because it was only 2 years ago so that I was here on the invitation of Vice-Chancellor, and it was in one of our casual conversations that Professor Bewaji and I had mooted the idea of a research institute. And here I am today being invited to the keynote at a conference hosted by that same research institute. So it's an incredible honor and privilege for me. So thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this great honor to share my thoughts with you. Now, the real challenge of doing a keynote at a conference like this that has several connections and threads and themes around it is that you are being asked to be a specialist in several fields. A specialist in African religions and spirituality, a specialist in the environmental humanities, a specialist in African cultural studies, and as I will attempt to complicate it in my presentation, a specialist in legal studies. It's a hard thing to do, but I'm going to try and make that attempt, because what I want to do with my presentation really is not necessarily to speak to the, or rather, not only to speak to the primary theme of our conference. What I want to try to do is to model the kind of interdisciplinary work that I think should be done, could be done at the center, and that I hope would locate both the Institute and the Federal University of Lokoja as an important hub of global scholarship on Africa, on the environmental humanities, on African thought, and on African creativity. Now, let me be very upfront about the fact that the talk that I'm about to present was an original piece that had written for an edited volume put together by a group of legal scholars all over the world who were thinking about some of the, what they call extra legal factors that impede countries from the global south and by extension the developing world to have access to environmental justice. What I needed to add to it was the element of spirituality, which is a real challenge. So it's that connection that I'm trying to make, that interdisciplinary connection between legal studies, between the cultural sciences, or what you call literary and cultural studies, and environmental humanities. Can you turn on the first slide, please? First slide, is it coming up? It's not coming up? It's fine, don't worry about it. I can do without it, it's good. Okay, so my presentation begins with an epigraph that is taken from a book by Zelensky that sort of theorizes the centrality of narrativity, or what you might call the cultural archives, in foregrounding discourses of environmental justice in Western literature. But I'm going to use that to make an argument about some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. And it says, what many masterpieces of world literature mirror are not simply the workings of the law, but more compellingly, the moments of crisis when society discovers that its laws have become problematic. Now, there is a thriving subfield of academic inquiry in literary whether in the context of retributive or transitional and or retributive justice, and I'm happy to make that statement. The main focus of that flourishing area of scholarship in English studies has been concerned with the interpretation of cultural representations of the law in varied forms of imaginative work, ranging from fiction, film, and theatre, to television, theatre, and the fine arts. Noting both the legal significance and the discursive power of this cultural text as forms of historical archives. Zelensky asserts that this vast literary and visual overview of narrative genres dealing with the law, its institutions, practitioners, and in very historical context, have been popular with global audiences from antiquity to the present. According to the Codex, the popularity of these imaginative works exists not because they glorify the law, but because they expose their moral ambiguity, as well as the abuses inherent in the legal system. Although our analysis concentrates mostly on narratives about the law in canonical Western literature, the landscape investigation provides really important inroads for thinking about the strong relations between literature and environmental justice, both as a social movement and modes of philosophical inquiry. And as the opening quotation that I just read to you suggests, in thinking about how literature mirrors injustice, efforts must be made not only to reflect purely on the law itself, but also on the ways in which the law and juridical practices are both constitutive and products of the broader culture itself, and spirituality and religion are essentially the main key ingredients of culture. Now, in thinking about the myriad of extra-legal factors that impact climate adjudication and its outcomes, the debate invariably reflects and underscores culture as a commanding force. Interpretation and implementation of the law, especially as it relates to the environment. Part of what my contribution or presentation to this conference aims to achieve is to establish how post-colonial literatures can address and undrape the moral ambiguities and legal maneuvers inherent in cases dealing with climate injustice in Africa. Given the centrality of perennial tensions between legality and morality, characteristic of legal fictions addressed by Zelensky, I want to reflect on how African literature that maximizes the environment and spirituality as its main narrative tropes intervenes in the neoliberal world order in which both the moral foundations and social expectations that underpin and animate the legal struggles of marginalized peoples seeking climate justice in Africa are often undermined by the ambiguities of the law. More specifically, I propose to show how post-colonial African literatures dealing with climate crisis in the continent can unveil the abysmally poor moral choices that the American and by extension the global justice system makes when confronted with the ecological harms caused by fossil fuel corporations with corporate origins in the United States. These harms or dangers are driving the prevailing climate crisis and could influence those litigating and adjudicating cases that seek to be responsive to the causes and impacts of climate change. Focusing my analysis on one primary text to illustrate this, which is what most of us in literary cultural studies do, we draw examples from case studies. Through the trope of nature and spirituality, I want to show how African eco-fictions serve to both expose and critique a global legal system that prioritizes the sanctity of doctrinal rules, or what legal scholars call legal formalism, over global moral good, that is, the health and welfare of despondent populations in Africa seeking justice for wrong being done to them by American corporations. There is a broad consensus that climate change is mostly the outcome of depredations caused by both human activities on the planet Earth. Greenhouse gases emitted by industrial and agricultural activities, especially in the global north, combined with other everyday human endeavors associated with a highly technologized world, have damaged the climate system and depleted the ozone layer. These phenomena has exposed the Earth to ever-intense sunlight and heat waves, triggering extreme and inclement weather conditions all over the world in the form of droughts, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and other forms of natural catastrophes. Despite the recommendations of a few climate change deniers, including the president of most of these people who've come from the United States, I argue that the real challenge facing the world today is not simply a recognition of the looming dangers that climate change poses to all of humanity, but how to address it through mitigation, adaptation, and reparation. And as Byron Moran has explicitly noted, and I'm quoting here, what proves to be particularly challenging is not so much recognizing that climate change raises questions of justice. Rather, it is in reaching an understanding about how justice is to be envisioned in the age of climate change. Now, the how of climate justice hinted by Moran above entails not just articulating a vision for the modalities to deal with the harsh realities of an imploding Earth, but also a painstaking diagnosis of the root causes of climate injustice. It is this latter part that I want to address in the two sections, or in the following sections of my paper. So I'd like to begin by talking a bit about the element of American patrol-imperialism in African eco-fiction. Now, the novel that I focus on, Mbolo Mwe's How Beautiful We Were, is set in a small village of Kosoa in an unspecified African country in West Africa, but the author herself is Cameroonian American. The story is told primarily by children who happen to be the main protagonists in the text. Characterized by narrative regression and temporal discontinuities, and recounted by children born in the 1970s, the story has a very circuitous arc. It begins in medias res in the 1980s, circles back to the 1950s, and even further back to the colonial era of slave trade in the 16th century, and then spiral backs to 2020 where the story ends. So the story is very much about the past, that is the lingering force of history, but it is also about how a past fraught with injustice has mangled futurity for vulnerable children, creating uncertainty and irrecoverable calamity for them, their families, and their wider community. In many ways, the text aesthetically engages in a form of historical mapping, drawing a fine historical line that sketches out the often unrecognized links between Euro-American imperialism, transnational capitalism, and the current global ecological crisis ravaging Africa and the globe. The main conflict in the text revolves around the environmental and health crisis in Kosovo caused by the ferocious mining activities of an American oil company called Paxton. At the very center of the major narrative stalemate in the novel's tale is crude oil. According to Sahel, one of the characters in the story, and I'm quoting this character, Paxton wanted more of our oil. Our government wanted more of their money. Now, His Excellency, this president, nameless president of this African country, wanted more of the world's finest things. So in the story, Paxton has received a blanket lease from an unnamed post-colonial African state to prospect for oil. The Kosovo people are not consulted in that concessionary lease to Paxton. After a while, the company strikes oil in several wells in Kosovo and begins drilling, and commercial production starts in late 1950s. Like many petro-states in post-colonial Africa, the Central African government, headquartered in the fictional place Lokoja, contributes absolutely nothing to defray the cost of crude oil exploration or production by the American oil company. It only collects a percentage of the huge oil profits made by Paxton. The company's official agreement with the seat of government located in the capital of Beza was that, quote, it would extract crude oil and the government would be responsible for all, quote unquote, negative externalities, which meant that the government had relieved them, that is Paxton, of any responsibility to the land and people in exchange for splitting the profits. Thus, the universe of this novel is representative of a defenseless social condition associated with post-coloniality, which Mukherjee sees as, quote, the name of a more intense form of imperialism where globalized, cartelized ruling classes continue as indirect control of colonies through intermediaries and compradors. The novel portrays how the catastrophic effects of crude oil drilling in Africa have enormous ecological or human cultural dimensions. As soon as Paxton starts drilling aggressively for crude oil, it directs all the chemical waste from its industrial activities and production into the local river running through Kosovo. And those chemicals in turn travel from the site of the company's industrial operations into the local community, poisoning the earth. The local river in Kosovo turns green and begins to flow sluggishly under layers of toxic waste. Paxton's very poorly maintained oil wellheads often explode and the massive spills seep into the local farms, destroying the crops and residential neighborhoods. But Kosovo is not only plagued by relentless oil spills which often turn into deadly fires that engulf and destroy local farms and scorch the earth. Things get worse in the Kosovo community when massive and violent gas flares erupt, the smoke blacker. For weird reasons the children narrators could not comprehend, the smoke from the industrial fires ignited by Paxton always blew in the direction where the villagers lived, never in the direction of the gardens and the hilltop mansions of the American overseer and his workers. So it's almost as if nature took sides with Paxton. I want to jump to the next section of my talk, dealing with what I call punctuated entropy. So far, I have demonstrated the ways in which knows how beautiful we were, addresses the rootless reality and impacts of petro-imperialism in Africa, and how that form of neoliberal petro-tyranny is actively augmented by post-colonial terror unleashed by the African political and military elites who act to protect transnational corporate sponsors and neoliberal godfathers. I have argued that what the novel suggests is that these dubious alliance between African ruling and cultural elites and neoliberal actors in the global north that makes climate injustice ungraspable for many whose lands, mineral resources, and lives have been destroyed by mining giants from Europe and North America. In this section of the paper, I argued that the novel divulges how both forces, that is post-colonial militarism and petro-imperialism, combine to animate irrecoverable social calamity on Africa. I draw specifically on Christopher Dyer's notion of punctuated entropy to suggest that if Mbo's novel is a narrativization of post-colonial environmental terror, the gravity of that ecological catastrophe is such that both individuals and the collective are unable to recover from the effects of the rapaciousness and the ferocity of petro-violence. I specifically show how the violent extractivisms of Paxton and the terror of the post-colonial state trigger enormous human-induced risks and vulnerabilities that African societies, cultures, and economies are incapable of short-term adaptation nor long-term recovery. Meaning that even if Kosovo, and by extension Africa, were to win its case against Paxton in court, we've seen that with the Niger Delta and other places in Africa, much of that legal victory would constitute only a limited form of climate justice. Now, Christopher Dyer defines punctuated entropy as, quote, a permanent decline in the adaptive flexibility of a human cultural system to the environment brought on by the cumulative impact of periodic disaster events. He predicts and explains the non-recovery of human systems as a permanent disaster. Now, the gradual weakening of socio-environmental adaptability and the rapid, egregious decimation of post-colonial possibilities of survival by Kosovans happens at several levels: familial, ecological, economic, and cultural. And I'm going to unpack those ones one by one. I would begin at the macro level, focusing on the family of the protagonist, Thula Malabo Nango. Now, he was the father and the head of the delegation of 6 men from Kosovo that went to Bezem to meet with officials of Paxton to appeal to the company to investigate the cause of mass deaths of children in their community. Malabo Nango had been steered to go to Bezem after the near-death experience of his younger son, Juba, who almost died from ingesting the poisonous water from the local community well. He and others in the delegation wanted to secure guarantees from both Paxton and the government that their lands would be restored to what it was before Paxton arrived to drill crude oil. But the men never came back. The group of 6 men from Kosovo were disappeared by the government in Bezem. A second delegation, this time led by Malabo's younger brother Bongo, was sent to Bezem for search for their leaders, but they came back without any concrete answers regarding what happened to their emissaries. Many months after their leaders had been disappeared, Paxton representatives came for a consultative meeting with the village and were asked about the whereabouts of the delegation from the community sent to Bezem. The 3 Paxton representatives feigned ignorance, declaring that, quote, Paxton did not involve itself with the whereabouts of citizens of other countries, unless, of course, they were its workers. These events led to the first eruption of civil unrest and violent protests in Kosovo, when the community, led by Konga, the village madman, kidnapped Paxton workers and held them hostage in the hopes that their rebellion would force both Paxton and the state to give them tangible answers regarding their missing kinsmen. One of the Paxton captives, apparently with an underlying medical condition, died while in captivity. The state's response was brutal. Not only did it kill 13 persons in Kosovo, injured hundreds of local people, including children, and raped countless women, they arrested the ringleaders of the revolt and hanged them after a sham trial. The Nange family loses its patriarch, and his surviving brother is also killed by the state. Then Tula, Malaba's daughter, returns from the United States 10 years later after studying there and sponsors a rebellion against the state. She too is also exterminated, killed by soldiers. So an entire family is completely wiped out. Now, if a weakened resolve to fight global oil giants is indicative of the psychological and ideological defeat of the Nanga family and the community, physical extermination is at the heart of the threat to the young generation that waged war in Kosovo. Disappointed by the sad news about Paxton's exoneration in US courts, and exasperated by the oil company's attempt to spite Kosovo with a countersuit demanding for its legal fees to be paid by the plundered village, 5 of the remaining youth activists in the village stormed the gardens with weapons and took Mr. Fish and his wife hostage. Mr. Fish was the new Paxton manager in Kosovo. He had been taken by the activist kidnappers to Tula's family hut and kept there for 3 days while waiting for Paxton and the government to respond to the ransom note supposedly written by their leader, Tula. Now, Kosovo's anti-activist and Paxton arch-rival. Now, as always, Paxton's executives in New York entreated His Excellency not to send soldiers to Kosovo, and that if he did that, there was going to be bloodshed and the company would cease doing business in the country. We know this happened in Nigeria with Shell and Abacha. Now, His Excellency is said to have sighed and told Paxton leaders to stop wasting his time with stupid bluff. Soldiers were deployed to the village with instructions to eliminate the insurrectionists, and they carried out the instructions to the latter. The villagers themselves heard the news of the carnage wrought by state soldiers from first-hand witnesses. Now, the tragedy of the 5 insurrectionists, Thula, Mr. Fish and his wife, and some of the government security agents, buttresses a crucial point made by anthropologists about contemporary disaster, that it is not just an event, but often a prolonged process. It is often an accumulation of a long and slow process with several dimensions that come to erupt in one major event that is linked to what we associate with calamitous actions, or what Henry Shue has termed compound injustice. According to Shue, compound injustice occurs when an initial injustice paves the way for a second, and when colonial exploitation weakens the colonized nation to such an extent that the colonizer can impose unequal treaties upon it even after it gains independence. How am I doing for time? A few more minutes? 5, 10? Okay, good. I'm good. Now, another dimension of irrecoverable culture-induced calamity in the text is the fatal fate that befalls the entire village. When the novel ends, Kosovo is no more. It is literally wiped out of the face of the earth by His Excellency's soldiers. When the soldiers arrive in Kosovo, they order the locals to evacuate their homes and indigenous lands with immediate effect. Kosovans were not given the opportunity to evacuate their belongings from their homes. In a public rhetoric that feigned deep concern for the lives and safety of the locals, that even Western Orthodox religions themselves have been. Now, I know where my specialty ends. I'm a professor of literary and cultural studies, not a professor of philosophy and theology. So I'm not a specialist of religious studies, and I feel genuinely ill-equipped to speak authoritatively about the correlation between spirituality and environmental engagement. But what I do see, especially from the quick research that I've done while preparing for this talk, is that scholarship on the links between spirituality and environmentalism is still very much at its infancy. And my charge to those of you gathered here for this conference today is that your duty, and in fact, it is your burden, to turn your critical lenses to that aspect of the ongoing environmental discourses dealing with the Anthropocene and the search for ways of mitigating the relentless freewheeling of the collapse of our global commons, mostly driven by late capitalism's greed and the unconscionable ecological chaos caused by neoliberal accumulation. And one way to do that is to transcend old and useless disciplinary boundaries that have impeded productive and insightful collaborations between scholars in the cultural or the humanistic sciences. There is truly no reason why scholars of literary and cultural studies should not be working with those in African religions and philosophy to tease out the invaluable insights and indigenous knowledges our ancestors shared about the protection and nurturing of nature. In Mbolombo's novel, for example, any discerning reader would see a clear binary between entities invested in ecocentric concerns with strong investments in the value of plants and animals on the one hand, and rabid anthropocentrism that blindly focuses on just improving the quality of human life alone on the other hand. The two main forces that trigger a revolt against transnational oil capitalism in the story are the village madman Konga and the twins who are the spiritual leaders of Kosovo. I am yet to mull over the deep spiritual implications of the narrative, but what is clear to any average reader is that the eco-poetics of the novel suggests that the sanctity, future, and survival of nature in Africa would be determined by the strong and unapologetic intervention of varied forces and forms of African spirituality. I am asking you today to find out what those modalities are and how indigenous spirituality can save the earth and those of us that inhabit it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please another round of applause for Thank you. Now this is an area I personally lack the capacity to interrogate. But I'm glad that we have priestesses and we have chief imams. And then of course we have the director of the center. He understands precisely what this is about. And so in a moment we'll be opening up the floor to interrogate very briefly this presentation that has been made by Professor Paul Booker. And if that's fine, with the kind permission of the Vice-Chancellor, I'll be calling for questions, observations, contributions as we take that very briefly and make progress from here. The floor is open with the permission of the Vice-Chancellor.
First and foremost, I would like to say thank you for even providing a lens in which literary arts are seen as part and parcel of environmental science, because there could not be arts without science. And you could understand And you struck a thread, and for those that aren't familiar, in Caribbean spaces, oil is an issue because our islands are small. One of the second largest oil refineries was in an island called St. Croix, and it only closed within the last 8 years. So everything you mentioned in that literary thread, persons that live there, including myself, have experienced. And I'm grateful because it's only because of our small tie to indigenous spirituality that we were even able to have conversations to speak about how important it was for us as indigenous, original African. I want to make sure persons hear that. Not just Caribbean persons, not just living in America. So don't get twisted up by the top. Make sure that you're hearing that we are like the prodigal daughters and sons back home. When we come here,
forging the connections between the environmental humanities, the medical humanities, and what they call the pure sciences. Between you and I, we've sat in rooms where increasingly we're seeing how the cultural sciences across the board are being defunded because of this perception that somehow we don't produce anything, right? Because if you are in the medical sciences, you produce knowledge and practices that save lives, right? You do a surgery, you tear somebody's heart, you fix their lungs, somebody breaks a bone, you fix it, right? If you're in business school, you design a model, something, you give it to a bank, an insurance company, they make billions of dollars. Well, you did something. You are in STEM, computer science, engineering, you design an app, you give it to the company, they make money off it, right? But it's assumed that those of us in the cultural sciences are really not producing something substantive. The question I often ask when we sit in this meeting is, if scientists in physics have produced an atomic bomb, and Americans have plenty of it, what is stopping them from flattening the entire world with it? Because they have the technological and military capacity. It is the humanities. You have dictators all over the world, and including one in your home country right now, who's itching to go to the streets and shoot people, particularly minorities. The only thing that is stopping him, it's the ideas of the cultural sciences. And tell me about an engineer who designed a bridge that didn't need the fine arts to sell it to somebody. I can put the Vice-Chancellor on the spot right now, and he will tell you how many architects came to him to make a pitch for any of these buildings and couldn't do it without depending on the human sciences, right? So I think part of what we need to do is to be very proactive about systematizing and not to be very humble about showing the indispensability of the humanistic sciences, the humanistic endeavors in whatever other disciplines are doing. And at my university now, our department is being asked to design English studies for law, English studies for nursing, English studies for engineers, English studies for mathematicians. You can do without it. And I would say that from my own experience of a PhD in English and cultural studies, 15 years after I left grad school, I wrote very few things on literature. I was working mostly in the Niger Delta doing research on the insurgency that was happening there, right? That puts me in environmental studies, puts me in sociology, puts me in anthropology. But I can reinvent the tools of literary and cultural studies, right? So the second part of my answer would be, those of us in these individual silos, disciplinary silos that we've carved out for ourselves, need to find ways of reinventing the conceptual tools of our disciplines in speaking to concrete and palpable historical problems confronting us. But finally, and most importantly, the power of storytelling. I do believe, and this is an idea that I have stolen, I should say, from Indigenous scholars in Canada, who make an argument about how literature and by extension other kinds of narratives can function either as poison or as medicine. Now, stories, particularly colonialist narratives, have been used to poison Africa and the black diaspora for many years. So in many ways, colonialist narratives are not any different from the crude oil poisoning our shores. But literature can also be medicine to heal our societies and our cultures, to recover from colonial violence. And what that means is that we have to start prioritizing teaching African and black diasporic stories in Africa.
Thank you very much. So, if you didn't get anything, while you were still breathing and we've not been wiped out of the surface of the earth, is humanity. When they have everything it takes to wipe all of us out, they will still think humanity. More of the contributions and questions and reactions, please. Yes. Please, can you come forward, sir? A round of applause for him.
Thank you very much. All protocol duly observed. We thank God for the excellent presentation of our professor abroad. God bless you. Yes, I just have Dr. Jisutuashi to share with you from Principal Bank University, Yoruba. So I want to ask this question, sir. Is it true that religion and spirituality has no place in global commerce and governance? And if the answer is in favor, that religion and spirituality actually has space, I want to know what are the influences, and if the answer is not favoring spirituality and religion, I want us to I want you to kind of settle that to it. Then yes, just as I said that the presentation was so powerful and excellent. What are the secondly now? What are the positive influences of indigenous spirituality as a panacea to their professions? Those the result of poor political influence that you mentioned of. Okay, so what are the positive influences of indigenous spirituality as panacea to those affirmation things? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Now, in order to address your first question, we need to remember the shifts that happened not just in the global north, but also in Africa following the French Revolution and the emergence of the Enlightenment, right? Much of what we know now associated with the Enlightenment was a particular kind of shift. Before then, let me use this to illustrate this. My background is in theater. How many of you have read Sophocles' Oedipus the King? The trilogy, Oedipus, a story of a child who, or those of you in Nigeria, you read The Gods and Int'l. Okay, good. So a child, it was adapted from that Greek classic. So a child is born, they take the child to the oracle, the child says, oh no, this child is going to kill his father and marry the mother. We give the child to a hunter, say go and dispose of the child. The child goes to the forest, gives the messenger goes to the forest and gives the child to a hunter. The hunter goes to another place and gives the child to a childless couple. And you know how in a small town everybody knows everything. The child is playing with his friends and they say, "Get off. You're going to kill your dad and marry your mom anyways." And he runs away and then he runs back to the same town where he was born. Then he kills his father and marries his mom and he has 2 kids. Now, I use that story not to explain anything about tragedy, but to explain what I mean by the disenchantment with, the enchantment with nature and spirituality. So before the Enlightenment, before what you call global modernity, European modernity, our obsession was with nature and spirituality. So if you wanted to know the future of your child, you take them to the oracle, right? If you wanted to know whether the roads were safe, you know what? You go to the oracle before you travel. Now, if you want to know the future of your child, you send them to a good school, like for University Lokoja. That's it. So that moment when the world, we were all enchanted with nature, thinking that nature and spirituality can tell us anything, was before modernity. After modernity, what we then have is the enchantment with scientism, with rationality, with logic. Okay? So now, as I said, if you want to know the future of your child, you send them to a good school. If you want to know whether the roads are safe, you hire soldiers with guns, they will protect you. You buy a good car, you construct a good road, right? Now, what we're beginning to see though is the disenchantment with rationality, logic, and science, because now everybody's saying what we used to eat, we're not eating again. That's why we're getting a lot of cancers, right? The kinds of herbs our leaders, the colonialists told us not to touch too many. Now they are the ones that are being sold to us to buy now, everywhere you go, right? You go to the stores, anything that they told us not to eat before, they say eat now. It's what is healthy for you. But they told us never to touch it before, right? Increasingly, you go to hospitals, doctors tell you, yeah, we don't do medicine, just take this supplement, take this herb. Well, if you have high blood pressure, don't take medication, just drink beets and ginger, and it stabilizes your blood pressure. So you see how there is a reversal of the enchantment. And I'm saying that this reversal of the enchantment with modernity and rationality and the obsession with scientism offers us an important opportunity for African spirituality to make an intervention in things dealing with the environment. Now, in terms of concrete modalities of how that can be done, I was very clear in my talk that I'm not a specialist in African religions and spirituality. The people who are going to give you those answers are the ones who are seated here. They're going to talk, when they do their own keynotes, they're going to talk about that, because I don't want to pretend, and which is my challenge. I'm saying, I do not know, and many of us do not know, but I'm saying you must really have important knowledges and insights to share about the ways in which African indigenous spirituality can help in healing our environment. That's my charge, that's my burden to them. I have no answer for that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we'll be wrapping up the Vice-Chancellor. We will be taking a short break now. And so if you permit, let me bring light to the microphone. Emeritus Professor Bewaji. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Normally, very senior leadership of the university, they always have important things to attend to. It's very rare for them to sit through, so many hours. So I want to really thank you for everything. Thank you. I would just want to punctuate what you have said by pointing attention at something. The ontology that says everything was created in a certain number of days, and then some group were created and they were put at the apex. It's the beginning of the destruction of humanity, and that is responsible for the attitude that we inherited from the Abrahamic traditions. It's the most pernicious, and undoing it is a serious business. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you so much. And I also want to appreciate the audience for the response. I know that we have been very patient. My guests, the university guests, they brought a lot of rainfall for us. It has not rained for almost 2 weeks. So I was very concerned. It was getting so dry, but they arrived yesterday and we witnessed serious rain. Thank you. So now we are going to go into a break. So we have been invited. We will only ask that we give the privilege to our guests to be served first, and then we can partake. So we will go for lunch and then come back for the next session. Thank you so much, everyone. Madam Registrar, may I invite you? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bewaji. This is one conference that is taking such a long time coming, and I'm glad that it's finally here and successful. So, Vice-Chancellor, sir, principal officers, your Royal Highness, and our dear guests, we have a tradition here to just appreciate all our guests, big or small, and we like to, on behalf of our council, management, staff, and students, especially students and staff of the Theology Institute, we'd like to thank you for your time with us. It's just the beginning. I'm sure as the conference progresses, you will not get much more than one professor who was delivered. I don't get so many things now. I'm not going to sing the title of this. I'm from the sciences. So that intersection between science, literature, and all, I think there's a lot of work to be done in that direction, and I'm sure faculties are no longer working in silos, even here on our campus. There's a lot of interdisciplinary research going on to address all of the challenges that we do have facing. I attended something in Germany maybe sometime last year. There was something about socializing resources, that in the global world would allow that even academic community to attend conferences. You know, we have to go cap and handling for sponsorship funding. That we can, as Africans, if they socialize that, be able to run our affairs effectively. And I think it's something we can look into. Government, and that's where I started getting really worried. All of our traditions, spirituality, even here in Africa, is no longer because people are ambitious when it comes to greed. Even when they profess either Christianity, Islam, or even African religion. So there's a lot to be done. I don't know where we start from. But when you know that my duty is just saying, thank you for your time,
Thank you very much. Just before we bow for the lunch, I've been asked to remind all deans to ensure that they come up with a set of sentences of this meeting, and to invite your postgraduate students to be part of the events tomorrow. The purpose is to be engaging, and if you can afford to be absent. With the permission, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, sir, you will lead your team to your conference to ready to take their lunch, and we'll be back to continue the session. Thank you very much.